My name is Graham Sack. I am the writer and director of the Lincoln and the Bardo virtual reality experience. My thanks to Cinema Without Borders for having me on to do this interview. The piece was just released by NYT VR. It's a virtual reality film in the form of a 10-minute long 360 video with spatialized audio. It's the first time that the New York Times is releasing an arts and culture oriented piece of fictional narrative. Previously, they've been very focused on immersive journalism. The piece is also a companion to the first novel by renowned American author George Saunders. George has been writing for several decades. He's had 8 short story collections. He won a MacArthur Genius Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and this is his first novel. The project began a little over a year ago. I had been interested in collaborating with George for a number of years. Many years ago, I read a piece that he wrote in The New Yorker that had, it was a short story that had sort of virtual reality themes in it. It was about a group of young kids who have images projected in front of their minds from commercials and seemed to sort of even anticipate ideas from augmented or virtual reality. I doubt that George or I at that point even knew what that word meant, but it was clear that there was something in his writing that was in conversation with that. So I approached him about the idea of doing something VR-based based on his work. And as we started to converse about what project might make sense, this book came up. So after reading it, I thought it had the characteristics that are required for a VR film. Not everything does. There's a lot of material that's better shot in a traditional film format. In the big differences with virtual reality are one, there's no frame. So the viewer has total discretion over where they look. You can't control the frame. All you can do is persuade. And so the first thing that you need is some sort of story where it makes sense for it to be shot in that way. Usually that means a story that has a very strong sense of place, which this did. It's set all in one night after midnight in a cemetery. It's narrated by this chorus of dead souls, and it was clear immediately that we would be able to stage that in a kind of surround way and really take advantage of all of the different dimensions that we had to play with. The piece is also very visual. Because of these supernatural elements, these ghosts that kind of populate the world, we knew that we could sort of make things appear and disappear at will. We could work with the images of the actors in VFX and add in, halo effects and trails or animated elements that accompany their images and really create something that used the full visual power of the medium. A lot of the way that it was that we approached the staging of it was by analogy with theater. Another characteristic of VR filmmaking that people are playing with is whether you can cut and how camera movement affects people. We decided early on that we were just going to use a single location and pretty limited camera movement with all of the action unfolding smoothly around the viewer. And so I think when you're in the experience, although there's an enormous amount of VFX in it, there are some sections of the piece. There's a giant crowd scene that has 400 pieces of composited video. I think the feeling of it when you're in it is really that the action is unfolding around you almost like immersive theater. We also intentionally cast actors who had a more theatrical background. We looked at a lot of film and TV actors who I think were generally used to, kind of acting at this scale. And what you really need in VR are people who can pull focus against a full environment, which is far closer, I think, to the kind of training that people have in theater. So almost the full cast were theater actors from New York who were making much larger physical choices, and vocal choices, and then we enhanced all of that with a lot of practical effects in terms of makeup and hair, so that they would really stand out against this kind of surreal environment that we were painting. In terms of the process of making it, I spent most of the summer trying to figure out how to adapt the novel into kind of a VR script format. I decided early on that I wanted to center it around this single dramatic moment in George's novel that I found deeply moving. It's this encounter between Abraham Lincoln and the soul of his dead son. And he arrives in the cemetery after midnight and cradles the boy's body as his soul tries to get his attention. And it was this very beautiful image that inspired George to write the novel. And when I read the text, it immediately, I found it deeply poignant, and it was the thing that I really wanted to put on screen. So that became kind of the keystone of the piece. And then I constructed a bunch of material around it to give it a full arc, so that you would sort of meet this chorus of dead souls, so that we would visually use the full environment, and then kind of lead into this poignant moment between the main characters. So I spent the summer adapting it. We went into pre-production in September and October. Pre-production for the VR film, I would say, looked very much like pre-production on a traditional film in terms of casting and set design and practical effects. The actual shoot was quite quick. The shoot was 1 day on location in Greenwood Cemetery, and then 3 days on a green screen studio. The actual mechanics of shooting it were, I would say, much more complicated than traditional film. We were shooting, when we were on location, we shot a full 360-degree plate of the environment. And then when we were in the green screen studio, we filmed several dozen actors that appear in the piece, similar to like shooting a Marvel film, with the additional complexity that the bodies need to line up much more precisely in space because you're working in 3 dimensions rather than just 2. And then we had a much more extensive post process. So when you're doing post on a 360 film like this, even if there are no effects involved, there's a pretty intensive stitching process, because when we shot in the environment, we shot on 4 separate cameras. And so to get the environment to look seamless is sort of step one. And that would be common to almost any 360 video. But then additionally, we were doing very heavy VFX on all of these characters, where we had chosen not to do any animation and instead shoot live action, and then manipulate the images afterward to give them this sort of ghostly supernatural quality. And we spent a huge chunk of the process on that. And then the last big component of it was sound. Sound is obviously important in any form of filmmaking, but I think it's particularly important in VR, because again, you don't have control over where people are going to look, and sound is one of the most powerful ways to persuade. So being able to, place Lincoln's footsteps over your right shoulder so that you naturally feel like you should look in that direction, or hearing a voice from off left, different things that can kind of cue the viewer that they might want to look over there. And so we spent a lot of time working with our sound design house, Silver Sound, on all of these spatialized sound elements. And now the piece has been released. It was released this past Friday, roughly to coincide with the launch of George Saunders' book, and now it's out in the world.